Chapter 181 Fighting Bugs. Chris. Point of view. Provisions are packed. Weapons are ready. Spare armor and metal is in Wagon 3. Is there anything you're forgetting? Abigail lectured while checking over the list in her hand. In the 2 days spent preparing, she had been focused on making sure we didn't forget anything. This would technically be our first campaign as a force of our faction, and the supply cache to bring with us was rather large. It was a lofty label to call 400 of us going off to fight demons a campaign, but it sounded better this way, if only for my own amusement. Deciding what to bring and what to leave behind fell to Abigail mostly, as we didn't want to take anything vital to the city or its defense, which was why her clipboard was filled to bursting with lists detailing our inventory. We were lucky this happened after the farmers planted all the seeds we brought, as that process had taken a lot of manpower, and I wasn't sure how they would have managed with half the workforce gone. Especially since those who chose to go were the stronger of the group, who did most of the rock clearing and plowing. "We are as ready as we can be, Abigail," I said. "There's no need to worry. I'll make sure everyone comes back." She huffed and looked up from her papers somberly. "That's what I'm afraid of. I know the danger you would throw yourself into if Gabriel or Mom got in trouble." It surprised me slightly that the two decided to join me. Gabriel made sense, as he looked for ways to advance, and this was perfect for that, but my mother didn't seem like the type to volunteer. Abigail tried to convince both of them otherwise, to no avail. I felt bad that we were all leaving, but I had confidence in my ability to bring them back. I would channel my inner Jonathan if I had to. As I did my final checks, everyone else could be seen doing the same. Those outfitted in new items from either Vinny, me, or the other Smiths were still adjusting and could be seen fiddling with the fit, but they looked ready. Remy was kitted out as well, even if I wouldn't ride him into battle. It took some work to get it to fit right, but a new layer of metal plating covered his glossy black coat. I didn't want to take any chances of my new friend taking an errant hit. The horse was one of my first companions in this new world, and he had grown on me tremendously. I knew he was strong, but I didn't want to see him hurt. He fought wearing the clunky and heavy get-up, but I forced him into it no matter how many times he huffed and complained. A few of the other horses had similar protections, but none were as obstructive as what I had created. It was Remy's strength that let him carry all the weight, and I doubted most of the other steeds could handle it while also being ridden. I checked the saddle straps one more time and made sure the armor sat right without any pinching, while Abigail checked over the papers one last time. A few other stalkers were observing from afar as I did my final checks, but I acted like I didn't see them, as they weren't supposed to be here. Both were supposed to be in school right now, and Abigail would scold them if she found out. Tufts of brown hair poked out from behind my tent, and I would have noticed the two hooligans even without my increased perception. They were lucky their mother was so distracted with everything going on, and Jonathan was off on an errand for me. Their luck continued as Abigail walked off in the opposite direction to check on someone else. Most likely Gabriel, as he was gearing up in the direction she set off in. The two ran out of their hiding place after she left and impacted both of my legs. If this happened before, I would have had to brace myself, but the force they carried was trivial now. "Do you have to go, Uncle Topher?" Anna pleaded with teary eyes, while Josh looked up at me with a similar expression. When she was told most of her family was leaving, she did not take it well. They had spent over a year with everyone being together in the same place, and this would be the first time we split up. Jonathan had left when we returned to gather his family, but that was only for a few days. Nothing compared to the multiple months we would be gone this time. "I'm sorry, sweetie, but duty calls," I said while patting her on the head. "But you'll miss my birthday," she cried, letting the tears flow. It hurt to see her so upset, and I knelt to comfort her. "Tell you what, I'll bring you a present when I come back from my travels to make up for it." I tried to cheer her up. Her last birthday was lost in the insanity of being transported, which made her even more excited for this one. The fact it would be the big 10 was another reason she was excited. Double digits were a big milestone. One I would miss. "You promise?" she asked, gaining some happiness back. "I promise," I confirmed. "Now, I believe you have another uncle who's departing, and he needs one more hug for good luck." With a pat in the right direction, they ran off the same way as their mother, and I was left alone. Without anyone else to send me off, I mounted up. An odd feeling welled up in me as I passed through camp. and being on horseback let me see more of what was taking place. Heartfelt goodbyes and last-minute hugs. Hundreds of people saddled down in whatever they could carry, departing from their loved ones for who knew how long. It wasn't long before we were off and the castle was disappearing behind us. Its construction would continue, but certain things would have to wait until I got back. The stone would continue to be mined and transported along with other smaller things, but I had to be there to lay the formations inside the walls. They had enough work that I wasn't worried about them sitting idle, but I also didn't want to be gone for too long. For some reason, it felt like this wouldn't be the last time we were riding out like this. Austin. Point of view. Mana burned through him as his eyes tracked his prey. The pressure inside him built up as solar flare drank in what he gave it. The spear in his hand danced as it left a trail of light in its wake. He fired off solar beams at any of the bugs that closed in quicker than his skill would finish, and thin holes were burned through their carapace. Smoke wafted into the air as they lost motor function and fell from the sky. His first foray into their ranks was a staunch failure, and their number forced him to retreat. When he first encountered them, he assumed they were only a temporary setback in his journey, but that turned out far from accurate. After lighting up the first few with his skills, an endless cascade of the creatures came out of the woodworks to attack him, and it took everything in him to get away. They had caused a lot more trouble than he initially thought they would. The man-sized insects were similar to a mantis, as they wad two weapon-like forearms they used to their advantage. Their chitin was thick, and it took effort to pierce his spear through, and his skills took more mana than usual, draining him the longer he fought. As he ran out and his mana dwindled, spear mastery was the only thing that saved him from critical wounds. After allowing the bugs in close, they proved their skill in close-quarter combat. Limbs ending in sharp tips stabbed at him from every angle, and it made him think of all the complaints Chris had about fighting him. Like an angry swarm of bees full of fury were after you. The irony that they fought with a similar fighting style to his own wasn't lost on him, as annoying as it was. Austin attempted to channel his inner Chris and shrug through all the attacks, but that didn't last long. His armor wasn't meant to defend against the onslaught he was facing, and the wounds added up faster than he thought. Even burning his bloodline at full blast wasn't enough to escape unscathed. After getting free from the swarm, his plan had to be adjusted. There was the option to just avoid the bugs, but no matter how far he went around, they were always in the direction his profession was urging him in. It was then that he realized the feeling was located at what appeared to be the center of the swarm, which made him alter his entire course of action, which turned into killing as many of the bugs as he could. The mana flowing through him and into his skill capped out, and he didn't hesitate to release it. Solar flare exploded out in a blinding light backed by a searing heat that came after. The bugs in his vicinity were instantly burned to a crisp as the heat wave backed by his laws overtook them, and those farther away fell to the ground in droves as their papery wings burned away. The heat was enough to sear his own skin if he didn't have reinforced body on full blast. Gaining his second law was what finally gave him the confidence to venture out alone. He still didn't have a lesser law like Chris did, but 2 least laws were good enough, especially when they combined so well together in his attacks. Fire and light melded together seamlessly when powering up his solar skills, and his affinity made them mesh without any worry of backlash. If he only had an affinity to one or the other, the possible backlash of the skill failing would burn his mana channels. The number of dead caused essence to rush into him, but it still wasn't enough for a level, sadly. After the week spent decimating the insect population, the essence they provided was the only positive thing to come out of it. The dungeons back home were his only source until running into the endless swarm, and they were serving as the perfect replacement. As the heat died down, Austin noticed a change compared to the past few days of fighting. There weren't that many bugs flying around, and it seemed he was finally thinning their number. He fought them for hours every day, but this was the first time he saw evidence of making a dent. That was until he saw why a few moments later. Through the thinned blob of insect bodies, he saw another group of people fighting them off, drawing them away from his position. It was a large group, and they all seemed huddled around the bank of a river. It was rather odd that they were fighting while stationary like that, but he didn't have the easiest time spying on them. While the bugs had thinned, that didn't mean they left him alone. Even as he stabbed out with his spear, he tried to keep an eye on what the group was doing. Their lines were coordinated and they had a proper formation set up denoting at least some experience. Those with weapons for close range lined the outer circle while the mages and rangers manned the inner one. Swords, axes, and maces alight with skills were easy to track as they fought on. Austin doubted the group could see him even with his rather visible skills flashing out. His eyes were still augmented with his bloodline and his field of view was far enough to look on easily while also remaining unseen. When he picked his bloodline, seeing farther wasn't his main concern, but it sure came in handy in times like this. It was the perfect way to scout things out while remaining hidden. When he eventually gained the ability to fly, his vision would come more in handy. Oddly enough, the group stayed at the river bank for only a few minutes before they started to orderly back away. The retreat was perfectly organized as one layer after the next fell back without getting each other's way. Right as the last turned to leave, Austin noticed a woman step up and do something. Without being there in person to feel the mana, it made it hard to know what she was doing, but he didn't have to wait for long. Streams of fire spewed outward and swaths of the bugs were incinerated. It put his outburst from solar flare to shame as the flames streamed out farther and wider than his skill. Even from where he was, the intensity of the fire was clear as his eyes picked up distortions in the air from the heat. It rivaled Rachel in skill as the veritable flamethrower persisted. As the flames died out, the woman turned and ran full speed away with the rest of the group. How curious. There must be a city over there. Chapter 182 Twin Cities. Marcus. Point of view. Relief flooded his system as the gates closed behind him, and yet another water run was completed without a single death. That accomplishment marked an entire month of no one dying. For whatever reason, for the past month, the water runs were getting easier. Even as excited as he was about everyone making it back, Marcus couldn't help but feel this week's run was different. An inkling of a feeling was telling him that it was easier compared to the last. While it had gradually lightened up, this one was the easiest so far. His mana was less than half full and his law still had some juice left in it, which marked the best condition he had ever returned in. Clarissa was flat out of both mana and mental energy, but that was to be expected. She used all she had during her attacks to kill as many as possible, so using her as a baseline measurement wasn't possible. Gregory, Marcus called out for his second. Yes, sir, Gregory shouted while running up to him. If you had to estimate, how much longer could you fight on? Marcus asked. Confusion flashed, but the man answered all the same. 15 minutes at least. 30 if I was conservative. Marcus nodded and sent the man on his way. His own estimates were close to that of his second, so it wasn't only him. A few more people said the same and things started to solidify in his mind. Things were easier this time, he just couldn't figure out why. They had done the same water run nearly 70 times by now and it was always the same. Even as they gained levels from the fighting, the bugs would always be strong enough to match them. They were growing at similar paces and the difficulty always remained the same. Except for now. Instead of feeling hope, Marcus was worried. The pattern they had gotten used to had changed and he didn't know why. He thought about it constantly even while going about his usual tasks. The Builders Guild needed more materials and he had to approve a trip to go forage them. The farmers were having trouble breaking up the rocky soil and he had to shift some higher-leveled people to go help. Managerial tasks that filled his daily schedule were completed while his mind kept gnawing on something else. The biggest project he had going on was finally seeing some progress, but even that couldn't take his mind away from thinking about the bugs. They were his never-ending problem and they popped up everywhere. Knock, knock, knock. Swift and heavy knocking broke his train of thought. Come in, Marcus announced. The knocking pattern was familiar and he knew who it was. The door creaked open and Gregory stepped through before shutting it behind him with a thud. Marcus looked up at him curiously. Sir, we have a visitor, Gregory stated. Is it the reservation again? Marcus asked, exasperated. The reservation had sent them a representative a few weeks ago to discuss trade, but they weren't able to come to an agreement. They saw the predicament Marcus was in and tried to exploit him because of it. They jacked up the price of food and materials just because they knew it was difficult for his city to acquire such things, which left a sour taste in his mouth. Saying as much in a not-so-polite manner caused negotiations to fall through. It wasn't a surprise they were back, but Marcus hadn't thought they would be quite as rushed. They must be just as desperate as he was. He wasn't able to get any information on how their settlement was faring without sending someone out, which he couldn't afford to do. From the one he met, they didn't seem to be the welcoming type. "No, sir, he's not from the reservation," Gregory said. "He says he comes from the north, up in Canada." The north? That was new. They hadn't heard from anyone north of the border since the change. "Did he say why he's here?" Marcus asked. "He did not. He only asked for a place to stay for a while, even offered to pay up front if that was a problem." Gregory stated. "This is odd. Visitors had arrived before, but never from so far away and not in a long while." As the months stretched on from the change, new arrivals tapered off as people stopped moving around and found places to settle. He doubted many were still wandering looking for a place to stay, which made this new arrival curious. He had other things to take care of though, and even if the visitor piqued his interest, he couldn't drop everything to go take a look. He dismissed Gregory with a wave and turned back at the reports in front of him. They would need, cough. Looking up, Gregory was still standing in front of the door even after Marcus thought the conversation was over. "Yes?" he asked, noting that there must be something more. Bernard was unable to get a level from the man, but he claims it is high. "Higher than Clarissa," Gregory said. "Oh, that changes things." Clarissa was one of the highest-leveled people in their camp and one of the strongest. She gained a lot of essence every week from barbecuing the bugs, which made her one of the fastest growers in the city. Why would someone from so far away and of such level be here? Were they able to uncover if he has a faction affiliation? Marcus inquired. If he could somehow sway the man into staying here, they could have another powerhouse to help in their assault. Even if the weekly water runs were ending without any deaths, they needed to assault the swarm eventually. They couldn't keep living in fear of the bugs, and they needed to begin growing. To build something prosperous, they needed to be free to venture out and gather resources, not hide behind the walls forever. They needed to claim the dungeons around the area. The 3 dungeons around the city were a sore spot for Marcus. The mana density rose in the vicinity of the dungeon, which caused the bugs to gather in the area, forcing them to fight through if they wanted to enter them. He knew from his tutorial the kind of resources that dungeons could provide, and it rankled Marcus to not have them under control. At every turn, the insects were there to thwart his plans. Yes, they were. "It's one we haven't seen before called Frostheim," his aide informed him. "First it's Des Moines, then the reservation, now Frostheim." He couldn't catch a break. "Maybe I can spin this into something useful. Canada is far enough away they could be allies instead of enemies. Inform him that I would like to meet with him, but don't be too forceful. Let it remain a request for now," he said, with this being the actual end of the conversation. His chair creaked as he leaned back in it to ponder what the man could want. "I'll find out if he accepts." Austin. Point of view. "He wants to meet with me? Why?" So far, Austin's attempts to not draw attention did the exact opposite. It wasn't difficult to follow the group back to their walled city and scope the place out. He had spent a few weeks just outside their range observing, but that quickly expended itself. Other than a surprise letter arriving for him, the time was mostly boring. To know more, he needed inside, which led to him approaching the gate like a normal traveler. The city was in rough shape, but it was better than the ones they came across in the caravan. Buildings weren't in tatters here, but there was visible damage to them from what he assumed were insect attacks. From the state of things, it was clear fighting happened regularly and consistently. Even with noticeable damage, the wall stood strong and looked to do its job well. It wasn't to the same standard as what they started building back home, but neither was it poor quality. Rushed maybe, but not bad. His scouting found only 2 entry points into the city, and both were gated and guarded, which didn't surprise him. Giving himself a once-over to try and not stand out, and so he appeared like a normal traveler, he approached the gate away from the bugs slowly. He planned to appear like a wanderer and request a place to stay for a few days and explore what he could. Exploring didn't always mean the wilds, and new places were just as exciting as great sights. He trusted his profession to block his level from being seen, and he pulled as much of his presence in as he could. Gabriel and Chris liked to call it aura, but Austin thought presence sounded cooler. Austin was much better at hiding his presence than Chris, as it was impossible to scout without doing so. If he gallivanted off without stifling his presence, every beast within a few hundred feet would know he was there. The gate guard didn't give him much trouble, and it raised his hopes of his plan working. There wasn't even a fee to enter. All of that came crashing down when a man appeared informing him that the man in charge wished to see him. So much for not drawing attention. He had no reason to refuse, and he soon found himself in an office not unlike his cousin's. The interior was obviously repurposed from a previous building, but it was hard to tell what it used to be. The decomposition and age of the building mixed with newer construction overtopped the old made it impossible. It was cozier than Chris's office, though, as at least this one was decorated. A burly man sat behind the only desk in the room, and it was clear this was the man in charge. He had an air that commanded respect and gave off natural leadership vibes. Seeing the big man behind the desk with stacks of paperwork reminded him of Chris slightly. If he ignored the black hair and clean-shaven face and squinted, there was a resemblance. He even had the broody stare of his cousin as well. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance. My name is Austin Zelensky," he said, sticking out his hand. His last name wasn't actually Zelensky, but going by it made things easier in the tutorial, and he just stuck with it. People got confused when he was a part of the Zelensky family faction without having the Zelensky family name. His hoity-toity introduction didn't elicit a reaction, sadly. Marcus Shieldwell. Patience was never Austin's strong suit, and he was burning up to know what the man wanted. "I'm curious why you've asked to meet me. I doubt you meet with every person that comes through the gates. Not everyone who comes through the gates does so alone and has the level you do," the man said succinctly. "Fuck, he's fishing." There was no way they knew his level, as he had a skill specifically to block that. And it wasn't the shitty common one Chris had. His profession was all about exploring, and one aspect of exploring was remaining hidden. No one in Frostheim could pierce through it, and he doubted anyone here could. How did they find out then? "The reason I've asked to meet is simple. I'm told you come from a faction up north. Is that correct?" Marcus asked while he steepled his fingers together. "I do," Austin nodded in response. He had said as much to the gate guard to get let in. It didn't seem necessary, but saying nothing seemed suspicious, and it wasn't like the knowledge was that specific. A single direction wouldn't give them any clues to where he was from, as there were probably multiple pylons in the direction he indicated. "As you are still affiliated with this faction, I assume you didn't leave on bad terms?" the man questioned. "Oh, this is getting good. What does he want exactly?" "I did not," Austin answered. "And if I wanted to work out an agreement of some sort, would you be able to facilitate that?" the man across from him asked with poorly concealed hope. Did he assume just because my level is high I have an in with the leadership of my faction? Well, he isn't wrong, but that's a far leap to make. Maybe being discovered like this was a good thing. He was here to figure out what his profession wanted in the river, and this city seemed to have an ongoing war with the bugs. What if I get the city to help me discover what the bugs are defending? Chapter 183, Agreement. "That depends on the type of agreement," Austin said while leaning back in his chair. Not enough to prop it up on two legs and be impolite, but enough to show his curiosity on where this was going. With his enhanced vision, Austin could see a vein on the man's forehead protrude from his antics, but that only spurred him on further. Marcus reminded him of Thomas, Christopher's father. Not to say he was a stick in the mud, but he didn't appreciate the frivolity Austin was showing to what he considered an important conversation. It was one of the main reasons he wanted nothing to do with leadership. It was all serious and tense without any room for entertainment or fun. It was hard to make jokes when you were literally in charge of people's safety. That wasn't the case for him now. He was off on his own and could do anything he pleased. His actions were linked to Frostheim, but nothing he did would push the boundaries. He wasn't that stupid. Just the thought of the lecture from his mother on making enemies for trivial reasons was enough for him to act properly if a touch loose. Let alone what Abigail would say. While a trade agreement is a good start, what I'm looking for is one of a more direct agreement, Marcus said ambiguously. It wasn't hard to guess what he meant by that. "You want help with your little bug problem," Austin guessed. The man stiffened but didn't rush to deny it. It was obvious what the man was after, but that made Austin curious about what he was willing to give up for such assistance. That would be the goal, yes, but any kind of support could be negotiated for, Marcus said. While it would be fun to ring him for all he was worth, Austin couldn't do so. The letter in his pack spoke of what Chris was doing, and he didn't have time to come down here and hunt bugs with him. From the sounds of his letter, he had his hands full with the goings-on up there. Unfortunately, that won't be possible, Austin said. From what I know, they are occupied with a problem of their own. The man showed nothing on his face, but the disappointment was clear. But I would be happy to help you with your problem. I may not be able to take on the swarm myself, but I'm no slouch, Austin said while tapping his chest. You know this for a fact? I assumed you would at least send word of such a request, if not leaving to deliver it yourself. Marcus asked, not yet giving up on this string of chance. Yes, I do. They have problems closer to home, and I doubt they'd come all the way here to help with yours, Austin said. From the way the letter from Chris was phrased, it was clear there was zero chance he would come here. After thinking, he added offhandedly, not unless they finish up there and you still need it, then I bet Chris could be convinced. As soon as he said it, Austin regretted it. His big mouth was getting him in trouble again, and the man pounced on his slip-up. Who's Chris? Marcus questioned. It wasn't Austin's intention to reveal how connected he was to his faction's leadership at the start, but he screwed that up. It wasn't a bad thing for the man to know, but it would change the way his relationship would be geared. If he knew how close he was, then he would turn into a diplomat instead of an average person. It would color everything he did, and he wouldn't have the same liberties as before. His words would need to be measured, and he couldn't do anything overtly anymore. Sneaking around would be taken as spying rather than exploring, which defeated the purpose of what he was doing. With a resigned sigh, he's the one in charge of the pylon. It was confusing what Chris's exact title was. Technically, the city lord was Abigail since she had the profession for it, but calling one the city owner and the other the city lord got confusing fast. He couldn't wait until Chris started upgrading the pylon so he could make fun of the pretentious noble titles, and so it wouldn't be as confusing. He already had the posh British accent. He would say them in down pat along with a practiced bow. And I take it you're close with him? The man asked. Sadly, even through his weird teenage years. Austin joked. But they're busy. Now, why don't we discuss what kind of help I can provide since I'm here? The next part of the discussion was more to Austin's liking. It was less about what his family was doing back home and what he would get for his direct help. The man was cautious and didn't reveal much, but it was clear what he was attempting. He wanted to launch an attack against the center of the swarm, hoping to kill whatever kept spawning the swarm. Be it a queen laying eggs or some other fantastical reason, thousands of insects kept appearing. Austin's guess was some treasure was the cause of the population boom, and once it was brought away, the swarm would die off. The one problem with that theory was if the treasure was immovable. If that were the case, they would have to kill the entire swarm to stop more bugs from appearing. Austin made sure not to slip up with anything more he said, and he managed to make it through the rest of the meeting without another mishap. It humored him that he came all this way to get away from that kind of thing only to be right back in it. After solidifying what exactly he would be doing to help, he was given liberty to go about his day. There was a weekly schedule they stuck to which made him have to wait a week until he needed to do anything. During this time, he took the chance to explore a new city. He noticed people watching him as he walked around, but that wasn't surprising. He expected as much after his slip-up, and he might have well said he was a spy. Even with a minder keeping an eye on him, the city was fun to explore. It was more rustic than the log cabins of his new home, but it wasn't bad. Everything was made of stone instead of wood, which was the biggest difference. It wasn't hard to figure out why that was the case, as everywhere around was made of the stuff. Rocks dominated the landscape outside the walls, and it wasn't an exaggeration to say it was more readily available than trees were. With all the houses, or huts in some cases, being made of stone, it made the city appear utilitarian. Almost like a militaristic base rather than the foundations of a city. Another difference was the markets. Since the amount of people was easily in the thousands, that made it a bit more hectic, but even with more people, the trade happening was less than what people did in Frostheim. Food and water were strictly regulated, and without coin to pay for things, it was hard to run a business. Bartering for things was the only way to trade, and that was mostly done with equipment. Observing the conditions inside the city made it clear why the man was so urgent. Just knowing Austin was from a different faction made him reach out and see if there was a connection there even without knowing anything else. What Austin originally thought was odd made sense the more he saw. The man was grasping at straws, hoping on the off chance something worked. It made him think about what he would ask for a reward for his help. They didn't seem to have coins to spare and weren't likely to give them up even if they had them. Materials were scarce as well, except for the mountains of insect carapace, but Austin didn't want that. The only thing they had in abundance besides that was stone, and that was equally unhelpful. It wasn't like he could wave his hand and teleport it back home for Chris to use. Still, he pondered on what he would ask for on his side of the arrangement. I'll figure that out later. There's still things to see. It would be a long week, but there were at least things to do here compared to being alone. Even if he would rather starve than eat the local cuisine. Austin's thoughts drifted to what Chris was doing. After the messenger ran into him while he was camping out fighting bugs a week ago, he couldn't help but think about what was going on. While he was tempted to turn around, he decided not to in the end. Chris had things well in hand, and Austin doubted things would go wrong. The man had more power than he thought he did. Chris, point of view. How much further? I asked our guide. I kept everyone at a quick pace after leaving, and we ended up making good time. Without snow to hinder us, the trip was quite quick. All the experience during our travels helped move things along at a fast pace. Took less than a month to arrive. We should be coming up on it now, Carson said. The group of 10 that arrived were clearly unaccustomed to such travel. They did not have the same experience with spending every day on the road like we did, and they appeared rather haggard. Some even had a hint of dark circles under their eyes from not sleeping enough during the journey. They kept their own watch at night, and I didn't blame them for it. We were still technically strangers, and I would have done the same, but splitting the watch 10 ways didn't help their sleep schedule, especially when we were pushing hard every day. They didn't complain though, so I kept at it while they managed to keep up. Riding a horse made things easy on me, but I still got sore after the long trip. What we finally came across made memories from the tutorial flash through my mind. The first thing that came into view from the new city was a field of wooden spikes planted in front of tall wooden walls. Similar to what we did to face the waves, and threw as many traps down as we could in front of the walls. Lines of stakes were angled chest-high circled the portion of wall we could see, and they were obvious recent additions. People were still working on adding more to the furthest line away. Mounds of dirt were piled around in various spots from what I expected were either pit traps or the beginnings of a trench. I wasn't sure how effective a trench would be against such creatures, but this wasn't my city to run. It would have to be a wide and deep trench to do anything against higher-level humans, let alone demons, unless they had a way to increase its lethality. Either through traps at the bottom, enchantments, poisons, or contraptions, but that was a pricey endeavor. Without knowing if it would be finished in time for an assault was a risk. Other than seeing the war preparations taking place, I was happy that the city still stood. It was a not insignificant fear that we would arrive at a city in ruins overrun by demons. It was obvious that our companions thought the same because their sighs of relief were audible as the walls came into view. As I slowed our pace down with the city now in sight, the woman who sat in our meeting with the bow dashed off ahead of the rest to inform someone of our arrival. The only thing that bothered me was the city appeared to be on the defensive. I didn't come all the way here to sit and wait for the demons to arrive. We would have to go on the offensive anyway if we were to kill them utterly. Calling for Hal and a few others who had tracking skills, I turned to our guests. Take us to the Ritual Circle. Chapter 184 Ritual Circle. Chris. Point of view. Carson fidgeted at being addressed directly and seemed conflicted on how to respond. Sir. Don't you think you should meet with the city lord first? If we continued at our current pace, we would reach the city in an hour, but that wasn't what was important right now. I was still uninformed about the details we were dealing with, and I wasn't going to trust what I was told wholeheartedly. I wanted to see what we were dealing with first to ensure we weren't being led on a wild goose chase. From the way the city was preparing, it was clear they were readying for war, but that didn't confirm what we were about to face. I wasn't well versed in demon summoning rituals, but I could at least check the degree of skill used to carve it. Compare what was there to what I or Gabriel made. It would give me a good picture of what level the person responsible for this whole thing was. At least the professional levels. The person's class was a complete mystery. You'd think that any who willingly summoned demons was a warlock of some sort, but that assumption was faulty. Any class could benefit from making a deal with a demon, which made finding the person responsible so difficult. When literally anyone could benefit, it was hard to narrow down the suspects. The reason I was so fixated on the person responsible for the summoning was because if we didn't catch them, the same problem would arise when they did it again. To kill the threat, all the demons and the person responsible needed to be killed, or it would just resurface. Tell him to meet me there if you wish. Time is of the essence, and I will not waste it on frivolous meetings. I told the man, which only worried him more. From the way they spoke of their city lord, I wasn't sure if he would take offense, but I hoped he wasn't so self-important to feel that way. We came all the way here to help him, and if he got upset because we didn't come meet him first, then that wasn't my problem. Even if I was nearly 100% sure this wasn't a trap, I wanted to see things with my own eyes. Everyone grab a horse. It will take a few hours to get there, but it's better than 2 days. I ordered the group of trackers that gathered around Hal and I. I saw all but one of the guests break off toward the city, and it made me snort to see who we were left with. Carson was the designated person to lead us there as everyone else in his group left. Liberating a horse from one of the carts, I got him to mount up as well to make the trip quick. As soon as everyone was situated, we were off toward where the ritual circle was found, kicking up dirt at a fervent pace. Ashton. Point of view. What he thought would be the final preparations were underway, and he could only hope it would be enough. They had worked non-stop to build as much as they could, and he could feel the dreaded hour coming closer. Their seer predicted as much, and being in the know only made him even more worried. The slamming sound of his door opening made him jump. This was it. They were going to tell him the city was under attack. Instead, he saw Victoria sprinting through the slammed open door, nearly out of breath. "Sir, we've returned with help," she said between breaths. Excitement flared, and he nearly jumped for joy at the exclamation, but he stopped himself in time to remain stately. "How many? 1,000? 2? He asked, already adjusting the plans in his head. Of the 4,000-odd citizens inside the city, only around half were fighters. Of that half, fewer still did it with enthusiasm. It was what made all the plans so hard to draw up, because he couldn't rely on those people alone. Everyone needed to be conscripted, and it hurt to force people to do so, even if it was required. "No, 400, she stated. His good mood dampened significantly, but he didn't say anything about it. It would be rude to insult any help they received, even if it wasn't as much as he expected or planned on. But they sent their best, or so we were told. Even the city lord himself came," she added to soften the blow. "The city lord came?" he questioned. That was nearly the complete opposite compared to how the other pylon responded. The South treated his warning as a trap and refused to send help. The North not only sent aid, but even their city lord came. It at least gave him hope that the 400 were at least fighting fit. His mind kicked into motion, and he rushed to welcome the person. "Quickly, bring them in. It won't do to leave our saviors outside the city," he ordered. It was then that another member of the group sent north came rushing through the door. "Sir, they broke off into a small group to go see the ritual circle. The man said if you want to meet then to do so at the site." Noah, the second to come rushing in, said, "What do they want with the ritual circle?" None of the trackers were able to get any leads, and it was a dead end on locating the demons. The decision to go or not warred in his mind. He wanted to meet the person in charge, but he couldn't leave his city in a time of crisis. He was needed here, and he couldn't go rushing off right now. Heaven forbid the city gets attacked while he was gone. "No, I can't leave now. Inform me when the man returns and invite him in." "What's the rest of the group doing?" he asked. With all the hectic construction and fortifications, they didn't have a chance to make room for that many people. Sure, they could squeeze in maybe 100, but 400 was out of the question. They didn't have the room for that many people. It was Noah who answered. They are waiting for their leadership to return to do anything. They don't appear to be anticipating an attack and aren't setting up any defenses. That made him confused. What do you mean? What do they plan to do then? I think they mean to go on the offensive. What? Are they insane? Chris. Point of view. With their guide, it was trivial to find what they were looking for and the trip was swift. It only took a few hours to reach the site and the trackers were already trying what they could while I examined the formation. Runes were an odd thing to understand and I doubted I had come anywhere near the full picture, but I wasn't the novice I once was. The amount of different runes I had seen gave enough information to glimpse a bigger meaning behind them, yet I couldn't understand them fully. I wouldn't for a while yet, but I was getting better with every passing day. One thing I did know was that every rune was different and all had a different feel to them. Durability runes were blocky and gave off a sturdy feeling when observed. Wind runes were marvels of twists and turns while feeling free. Depending on the deeper meaning of the rune, the way it was carved and the feeling it gave off changed. The ones I was looking at now gave off a hideous feeling 10 times worse than the demonic leopards. They were carved into thick stone and filled with blood. Blood that had since dried and took on a blackened look, like it was infected after use. The ritual did something to the blood that made it impossible to determine what kind it was. I could only hold out hope that it wasn't human, but I wouldn't delude myself into thinking that it wasn't a possibility. The string of runes formed a perfect circle in the stone, centering around a raised altar where the formation converged. It was where either the materials used in the summoning were placed or where the sacrifices were dispatched. Based on the blood dripping from the altar, they used sacrifices. Not uncommon in the readings about demon summonings. I tried my best to pick apart what I was looking at, but I had no experience with this kind of thing. The books explained what I was examining, but they didn't present the entire picture. Even sensing the scene with basic runecrafting and formation mana flow didn't tell me much. It gave off different feelings and information than what I was used to, and without background knowledge, I didn't know what any of it meant. The runes I crafted with were easy to understand. I spent hours carving them and hours more studying them. I knew them on a near intimate level, but these were something completely different. It was like they took the natural order of things and deliberately twisted it, infected it with something, well, demonic. Instead of deliberating on the knowledge I didn't know, I looked at how it was carved. The imperfections in the stone that caused slight mishaps during carving or when the person got tired and slipped up. Imperfections in the flow of mana lowering the quality of the formation, and signs of untrained craftsmanship were abundant. I was glad to see that the formation wasn't perfect, and I could confidently say I was a better engraver than this person. Things would have been bad if I couldn't see any flaws and the person was so far ahead of me in terms of skill. That spoke of levels much higher than mine and of formations I would have no hope of cracking. Instead, it looked like slightly better than amateur work. It was hard to pinpoint a level range, as that didn't directly determine skill level. You could be high level and just suck at engraving, or be low level and be a genius and achieve the same result. Or, worst case scenario, the person didn't even have an enchanting profession and this entire thing was free-handed without any skills. That was the least probable outcome, as there wasn't enough time to study such a thing. The only reason I had advanced so far enchanting-wise was because I had skills to guide and help the process along. If I had to walk blindly in the dark and be completely self-studied, I would be even worse than an amateur engraver. The person we were dealing with had to have at least some profession related to enchanting or bought enchanting skills inside the tutorial. Due to the skill, I would guess it was a profession, but I didn't rule out the possibility that it could be independent skills. I was just finishing up when Hal came jogging up to me. "Tell me some good news, bud," I said. While I wouldn't call the trip here a bust, I didn't get as much from the formation as I would have liked. "We've got a trail, but it's faint. It could lead to nothing, but it stinks like demons," Hal said. "Where does it lead?" I asked. Instead of answering with words, Hal pointed over my shoulder into the distance. "Shit." The direction was even further south, taking us away from the rest of our forces. "Hal, how confident are you in stealth?" I asked. I knew stealth wasn't his strong suit, but I hoped that he had at least something to aid him. He used to be a ranger after all. One low-level skill, but nothing else. I don't really focus on that. He answered. Well, you're the best scout we have. Take those who at least have stealth skills to follow the trail and meet me back at the city with what you have. I'll be ready to march on whatever you return with, I said. Hal looked at me skeptically. The city didn't look like they were ready to sally out for an attack. How are you going to convince them? You leave that to me. You just find the sons of bitches so I know where to go, I said. Chapter 185. It will have to be. The trip back to the busy city was just as quick as the trip there. A few hours later, I was right back to where I started, staring ahead at what would be my first diplomatic meeting. It wasn't that serious, as we were fighting a common enemy, but it was technically my first meeting with another city lord. Tracy didn't count as I knew her from the tutorial and I hadn't actually met their city lord. The fact her pylon was leagues away from mine helped matters because even if I did cause offense, it wasn't like they were going to chase me all the way north. But this was different. This pylon was one of our nearest neighbors and there would be no running away if I managed to flub things. While highly doubtful, the possibility was there. I had watched how the people who visited us acted and how they talked about their city, and it gave me a decent idea of what I was walking into. Nothing specific was revealed, but an idea nonetheless. The group was courteous and polite without any direct arguments breaking out during our time together. Unless the city lord was the complete opposite of the people he sent, I wasn't overly worried. My biggest thought was on how I would get him to abandon defense and go on the attack. Even as I walked up to the settlement gates, more traps and defenses were being constructed. Even after knowing help had arrived, he was set on building up what he could. The worst outcome from our meeting would be his refusal to go out and attack the demons once they were found, which would be monumentally stupid. Demons were a ticking time bomb, and the sooner they were vanquished the better. We didn't have time for him to turtle up behind his walls as their number grew with every new summon. And if there was an intelligent demon in control, they would wait until they had overwhelming numbers before doing anything. Waiting was death, and I wouldn't allow that to be an option. I had Carson walking next to me as I entered the gates and the people inside parted for us to pass. I left Remy behind with the group and chose to go at this on foot. My armor and hammer were with me, and even if I didn't think a fight was probable, I was still ready. The buildings I passed were mismatched with new construction mixed in with old. Some of the buildings were just reconstructed from being destroyed while others were completely new. New growth rings of the city were the first we traveled through after entering the gates, and we transitioned to older structures as we walked toward the city center. There was no inner wall, no castle at the center for defense. It was a town full of regular buildings surrounded by a wooden wall. It was funny to see how differently we approach city building. I was focused on fortifications above all else, while what I was looking at made it seem like defense was an afterthought they had only recently seen to. The only good thing they had going for them was the town butted up against a lake. The direction we came from made the lake sit on the opposite side of the city out of sight, but it was revealed while getting closer. Other than being on the shores of a lake, the city had nothing else going for it. The best way to fortify it would be to build a castle inside the lake, but that was long in the future. The amount of manpower required to build up the foundational earth for that to be possible would take forever, but that was the best option my mind could come up with. Still, being surrounded by water wasn't the same deterrent it used to be. A powerful water mage would turn the moat against you, using the readily supplied water as fuel. Ideas of how to fix that and make moats more deadly flashed, but I waved those away. I didn't need to be thinking about what I would do differently when it wasn't my city. The only thing I could admit was at least they were trying to make up for it now. The wooden palisade ringing the town wouldn't hold against anything too powerful, but it was at least better than nothing. Could be quickly enhanced by piling dirt behind it to make it more robust. Carson didn't speak much while walking through his home, and I didn't ask him to. A silent observation of what we passed through was good enough for me. I didn't need a tour. Similar to our own city before we left, people were busy at work inside various workshops. The clangs of hammer blows were most obvious, as smithing was the loudest profession by far. Hides were laid out in the sun to dry, while those already prepped were no doubt being sewn into armor. The city was in full conscription mode, and people moved with a purpose between the different buildings. It was hard to gauge the strength people held, as the density made it all blend together into a blob. I couldn't pick out specific people, which ruined any attempt to know how strong they were. Levels were revealed on some, but my identify was weak enough that any run-of-the-mill blocker could obscure it. From what I could see, it didn't seem that different than my own city. The levels here were on the lower side of our average, but it wasn't that big of a difference. Our months of traveling gave us some levels, but not as many as we would have from being next to a dungeon 24/7. Well, for those that chose to enter it, people who shied away wouldn't see any quick increase in level for their class. The fact we were still ahead was only because of the monsters we had to travel through. Carson led on through it all, and I could see what I assumed to be the management building coming up. It appeared like a city hall from before, but repurposed to be the command center. People rushed in and out of its doors, constantly taking orders out or bringing information in. The building itself stood tall and was one of the few entirely made of stone. It was also where I expected the pylon to be. While pylons had a beacon effect before they were placed, they were harder to sense afterward. Not to say they were hidden, but they were more subtle with how they worked. If I had to guess the reason why, I would say it was so unplaced pylons couldn't be lost or hidden for long. The system made a big deal about owning land and making sure only certain people were able to do so, and hiding a pylon or smuggling it away defeated that purpose. Once purchased, everyone would know what was in your possession and there was no hiding it. After it was placed, though, it was easier to disguise or mask where the pylon was hidden. It was easy to tell there was one, but not its exact location. Being able to hide it after it was placed confused me, but it wasn't my biggest concern right now. Carson led me through the doors into the building, and I was met with a wall of parchment on either side. Crude maps from fledgling cartographers filled the building with loads of different things written on them. Points were circled and lines were drawn detailing various construction taking place, while others were of older dates. They depicted the city before the wall was built and at various stages of development. The wall of parchment had people checking on it and adding words, but I didn't have a clue what most of it was about. There was way too much information to catch anything as we passed by and into a long hallway. Doors lined either side of the hallway, but none were where I was led. Small alcoves or rooms were where most of the doors led, as a few were open, revealing what they contained. We breezed by all of them, and it became clear we were heading toward the lone door at the end of the hallway instead of any of the branching ones. As my steps neared, I took a deep breath to ready myself. I wasn't scared, but it was hard not to feel nervous. Diplomacy was not my strong suit, and I did not like having to do it. The fact it was necessary and would continue to be only made it worse. Anything I said or did could affect our future relationship, and the fact we were neighbors meant that would be a constant one. Prepared as best I could, I stepped through the door. Inside the room, there were 3 other people except for Carson and I who just entered, 2 of whom I'd met before. Off in the corner was the strong woman with the bow, Victoria. The warrior who I'd met, Nathan, or Noah, I couldn't remember the man's name, sat next to who I assumed was the city lord. All in the room were armed and armored, prepared for a fight to break out at any time. I didn't think they would fight me, but ready to fight in case demons attacked. Even knowing they weren't armed just to meet me, it made the room tense anyway. With everyone in a state of battle readiness, it didn't matter we were supposed to be allies. When an unknown with a weapon stood before you, it was hard not to tense. The man in charge was seated at a meeting table with chairs arranged for 3, 2 straight across from each other, with the third placed off and behind. Close enough they were still at the table, but clear they were support rather than another voice. "Hello and nice to meet you. I must express my appreciation for you coming to our aid." The man, who I knew was Ashton, started the conversation with platitudes. With only a few people in the room, it was easier to pick out the feeling specific people gave off, and this man reminded me of Jonathan. Even without seeing the shield leaning against his chair, it was clear he was a defender. But instead of a sturdy mountain that Jonathan felt like, one immovable if it chose to be, Ashton felt like a steadfast source of light, a comforting presence that would prop you up if you were to fall. It was an odd feeling, and one I hadn't felt before, but I could guess what it was from games I used to play. He was a paladin of some sort. I wasn't sure how faith or religions worked now with the system and all, but what I could feel was hard not to associate with paladins. He even had the sword and shield combo to match. The armor he wore matched my own in heaviness and even exceeded it in some areas. I made mine to go under my frost armor, but his was made to be his sole protection. When he stood briefly to greet me, he matched my height, putting him over 6 feet. His face was devoid of facial hair, and his brown hair was meticulously trimmed. An odd detail to keep under control with the world in its current state. Even his eyebrows looked curated, oddly enough. After peeking around the room and the new face in front of me, I took in his stature. The armor made it hard to tell, but there was a thickness in his limbs speaking of high strength. It wasn't a foolproof rule that thick arms meant high strength, but it was common. With appearances observed and platitudes to start, I followed suit. You called and I have answered. I know the threat demons hold and cannot leave it to fester so close to home. It wasn't what I really wanted to say, but I couldn't leave the man hanging. Introductions are in order then. This is my first time meeting another pylon owner and, truth be told, am unsure of the proper procedure. He said with a laugh, trying to lighten the atmosphere. My name is Ashton Seeger, city lord and faction leader of Fort Hope. Christopher Zelensky, city owner and faction leader of Frostheim. I matched before we shook hands. It felt weird to be so formal about this, but it was essentially a meeting between foreign delegates. Not that we were the size and strength of countries before, but that was essentially what we were. 2 separate forces meeting for the first time. Ugh, the formalities are only going to get worse. With that out of the way, we can get into it then. I'm told you came with 400 fighters, and I'm pleased to have them. We're currently adjusting our battle plans with the additions in mind, so feel free to share any inputs you have that could help. He said, bringing out a map of the area with the same drawings I had seen on the way in. My options on how direct I wanted to be flashed in my head, but I decided to handle this like I had before. Direct and to the point worked with Tracy, and keeping that would be easiest going forward. I've come to fight demons, not defend your city. I have trackers out searching for them now and intend to march once they are found. Time is of the essence, and I cannot waste it waiting for them here. I stated succinctly. The room fell silent at my announcement, and it was clear they were caught off guard. I expected as much as I saw zero preparations for an offensive battle. You intend to lead an attack against them? Ashton asked questioningly. I do. We need to find them first, evaluate their strength, and vanquish them as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the harder it will be. I said, we can't depend on them coming to attack here when so many other things can happen. What if they run south and never come back? We know the consequences of such a fate, but we can't do anything without information. All our scouts and anyone with a tracking skill are running around the countryside looking for them without any luck, Ashton said. Hearing that eased my mood. It was hard not to look at all the defensive preparation and think they weren't doing anything besides that. Hearing they were actively looking for the demons was good news, even if they had no leads. Then I will add those I can to the search. If we pool information, we should be able to find them faster, I said in a lighter tone. Then it shall be done, he said with a nod. But are you sure going at them with our numbers will be enough? While I can force people to defend their home, forcing them to march is a completely different story. How many can you estimate will come? I asked. I don't know. A third? A quarter? Half if we're lucky. He sighed. Will that be enough? It will have to be, I said. Chapter 186 Threads. With our first meeting concluded, it left time for a few awkward encounters. It was obvious that neither I nor the other city owner knew how to treat one another. I didn't care much for throwing my weight around, and he didn't seem to want to impose on me either. It made things strange at first, but they eased as the hours passed while the trackers were still out. The group with Hal still hadn't come back by sundown, and neither did the other group from the city. It did worry me a touch when Hal didn't arrive back at camp, but I trusted him to get the job done. Or, at the very least, to be so noticeable that we were alerted to something wrong. While I sat and waited, I stayed outside of the city mostly. I had our group set up a very temporary camp with only the bare minimum in terms of structures. I wanted everyone to be ready at a moment's notice. I almost didn't have people set up, but ended up thinking better of it. While Ashton had agreed to go on the offensive if the demons were found, His city didn't look like the pinnacle of readiness of being able to do so. He was only just now gauging how people felt about going and getting numbers on the volunteers. If word came back now that we had the trail, he would need at least a few hours to get everyone in order on his side. While it was frustrating to know we would be ready and waiting well in advance, there wasn't anything I could change about it. The hours spent waiting for word certainly helped him get his ducks in a row. The more time that passed without any new information gave him that much more to be ready when it eventually did. Other than only waiting, I ran over a few battle preparation things ahead of time. This was going to be a direct assault on a mass of enemies rather than what we were used to. The training for defending the pylon wouldn't help much in this instance. Without Hal, it left Rachel, Gabriel, my mother, and myself to discuss plans and come up with something viable. Of our council, Braden, Sam, and Vincent chose not to come, and Jonathan, but that wasn't by choice. One main thing we had to worry about wasn't even the fighting itself. It was not letting any of the demons get away. I was hoping when word came back we would have a clearer picture of what we were dealing with so these plans could be finalized. Without knowing the composition or type of demons we were up against, it was impossible to put plans in writing. There were a few different demons that could have been summoned, and they acted differently and had different strengths and weaknesses. The rank was impossible to know without setting eyes on them, but I could guess from the formation. While the blood was untestable to find out what was used as the sacrifice, the formation itself gave some information. The care and effort, let alone the skill, required to create such a thing spoke of the person being in the E rank. While someone below level 50 could have done it, I didn't think it was likely, especially with only a year being passed since knowledge of such a thing was introduced. What sealed the deal, though, in my mind, was the reason behind the summoning. Even the most sociopathic would have a reason behind doing such a thing. Deals with demons were infamous even before the system arrived. The reason I ruled out the person being below E rank was mostly because no demon below that would have anything worthwhile to offer. Summoning demons was similar to spirits in the regard you could only summon something up to your own rank. Without special care and extremely rare ingredients, your own rank was the highest you could summon. Plus, for demons it was ill-advised to go higher. Summoning a demon stronger than you without protections put in place was folly. Even without experiencing such a ritual before, I would have been able to notice if there were such protections. I had spent extensive time since our return studying that exact subject. Wards and defensive formations were much more in my wheelhouse than summoning rituals. I spent multiple hours every day furthering my knowledge of wards, and while it sounded arrogant to say so, I would have been able to tell if there were any containment wards attached to the formation. Not unless the engraver had a skill level so far above me that it was impossible to pick up on, but if that were the case, we had bigger problems. That said, just because the first demon summoned was E rank didn't mean all of them would be. Demons didn't have the same rules for summoning more of their own kind as we did. They didn't need such ritual circles and could get away with ritual casting if there were enough. The way it worked still wasn't entirely clear to me. Rachel, how does ritual casting work exactly? I asked, trying to understand. Well, it starts by linking the participants together in something akin to a formation. Instead of runes and mana stones, though, it uses people and their skill manipulating mana. If a formation were a computer-automated version, a ritual casting would be a manual version. She said, "Yeah, but how do they compare, though? Does one take less energy? Get worse results?" Gabriel asked. "That depends," Rachel said. "I'm not that well versed in formations, but from what I understand, the materials involved in making them play a key role in how they work. It's the same for casting rituals. The skill of the people involved plays a big role in how well they work. 6 novice mages won't hold a candle to 6 experienced mages. The shortcut that demons had was if there were enough of them, they didn't need to use such ritual circles, or, if the original demon was strong enough, only one was required in the casting. As a race, they had advantages in leading such rituals, and they excelled at it even. It was like their race was trying to get them to expand and colonize. It was one of the main reasons they were hated so much by all non-demons. Their need to colonize and drive to consume put them on bad terms with nearly every other race in the multiverse. The only thing keeping them from being killed off was their strength. The fact they grew more intelligent as they gained power and could assuage the urge to consume helped matters. If demon gods ran around destroying planets and civilizations, it didn't matter how strong they were. Enough people would band together to kill them. The details of the demon race and their standing in the multiverse weren't important though. All that mattered right now was wiping them off the face of the earth. Sadly, even with our timely intervention, I doubted this would be the last demon hunt I would participate in. Even if we caught the person responsible, another would fall to the temptation. The fact it happened this early after being gifted new powers only spelled out what we, as a society, were in for. It was a fun thought experiment to think about though, if a bit sad. Years down the line, when people were born with the system already in place, would they be more or less likely to fall to the temptation? I dismissed those thoughts to focus back on the matter at hand. Even with Rachel's explanation, we wouldn't know anything with certainty without knowing which demon was summoned. Imps, hellhounds, demonic converted beasts of any kind, demonlings, and lesser demons all went about things differently. Common sense made us throw out the possibility of any non-sentient demon, but that wasn't something we could do with 100% confidence. Any demon could make a deal, even if convention said hellhounds couldn't communicate. Most types were inclined to summon more of their own type above all else, but there would be a variety of them given time. With hours spent going over the local maps provided to us, it wasn't until Hal came back that we had something to work with. What he had wasn't concrete, only a direction, but it was better than nothing. He didn't end up coming back until noon the following day, marking our second day since arriving. Hal's group was able to follow the trace they had further south and came across an increasing amount of evidence. Whether our trackers were better than Fort Hope's wasn't confirmed, but we at least had someone with a better skill. Informing the city of what we found sent them into a tizzy. It sped their plans up significantly, and while they took a while to form up, it wasn't as bad as I feared. As soon as Hal came back and signaled, he had their trail. Our camp was up and ready within the hour. Fort Hope wasn't ready until 3 had passed. I stood at the head of our group as we watched those from Fort Hope march out. Hal, how many do you spot? I asked. We were a distance away from the city gates and he had the best eyesight in the group. I could have tried to count the ranks coming out, but it was easier to ask the man dedicated to scouting. Plus, he had experience doing just that during the waves. Hard to tell, they aren't the most organized ranks, but from what I can tell, 1,000. 1,200 at best. He answered. More than we feared, but less than we hoped. I sighed. Adding our numbers put us at roughly 1,500 strong. The largest army I had ever been a part of, but I still couldn't help but feel worried. Demons were not to be underestimated. Their city leader marched at the front, armor gleaming in the sun and shield and sword at the ready. He was even more armored than when I last saw him, with a knight's helmet to finish the suit. The plated man was the epitome of a medieval knight, and his paladin-like aura only made the picture more accurate. He led similarly to what I did, awkwardly but with authority. What I assumed was his inner circle followed close behind. The ranger with the bow looked much the same as when I'd seen her last, along with the other members of their group. Only the 3 who met with me marched close to the leader. The rest of the 10 who had ventured to my city were either further back or staying behind. The man, Carson, I confirmed to be a mage rather than a healer. Other healers wore a familiar red cross somewhere on their getup that the man lacked. I suspected he would be a mage of some sort, but this confirmed it. I could have asked during our month spent traveling, but that wasn't something discussed outside of family. Even asking reminded me of other taboo subjects from before. Still, watching the people who would march with me come streaming out of the gate made me feel something else. These people would be my comrades in arms in the fight to come. My companions on our warpath. Even with everything we'd been through, it was hard to think what I felt was real. Even with magic, a castle, and a weird system, something about marching off to war kicked me in places that were different than the rest. Most of the group were just regular workers less than 2 years ago, yet here they stood. Hell, here I stood. I was armored and armed with medieval-style weaponry and armor, standing at the forefront of what could be considered my army. The feeling coursing through me made me stand and take it all in with clarity. The people I watched coming out of the gates were to fight with me, and the people who stood behind me were to fight for me. The severity of what we were about to march off to face had never felt so heavy. The burden I had dismissed when the chance first arrived. When we were transposed into what we were, I faltered and shrunk away from the responsibility. I watched as another took up the role and followed listlessly behind. It was a stark difference to what I was doing now. The weight of people's lives were in my hands, and it was just now dawning on me that not everyone would make it back. Sure, I knew that intellectually, but now it felt all more real. Like the threads of fate were only now settling into place, and our course was too far along to end up any other way. Some of those threads would be cut short soon, and the only thing I could do about it was grip my hammer tighter. Chapter 187 Doom and Gloom. Gabriel. Point of view. While having his legs back was the single best thing to happen since their return, it didn't stop him from complaining about the aching. After setting off from the new city that he didn't even get to explore, they set a grueling pace. While he was one of the lucky few to be on horseback, that didn't stop the cramps and soreness from riding for so long. They had spent a month traveling only to rest for not even 2 days before they were off again. It was a lot to handle, and some were visibly flagging. He heard whispers about it whenever his family got together to talk strategy without him. Not that he wanted to be involved. He had firmly refused to be a part of their council for a reason. He could still share his opinions, and he had, but he didn't have to get filled in for every little detail. If he was being honest, he really didn't care. His focus was on much more important things, like magic. The tutorial had taught him a lot, but that was nothing compared to what he knew now. Aunt Rachel had such a wildly different take than he did, which only expanded his knowledge further. While he had focused on creating and manipulating his own ice, Rachel focused on something different: mana manipulation. She could pick apart his skills if he didn't try to defend them with startling ease. It was something he hadn't thought much about before. His head was in the metaphorical clouds with magic, focusing on all the cool things it could do, creating new effects on his skills or changing them in subtle ways so they did something else. Combat was a focus he zoned in on occasionally, but it seemed Rachel spent all her time on that. Knowing how their tutorial was made that unsurprising. Still, it was nice to get other perspectives and expand his repertoire. Training with her for nearly a year did wonders for his skill, and was the main reason he felt so confident coming along. He wouldn't say he was scared, but it was hard not to feel something knowing they were about to fight a horde of demons. The very things games, novels, and nearly everything depicted as evil incarnate. Even knowing that the race wasn't exactly how it was described didn't help with the feeling. The things they came across only made him feel worse. He knew what demons would do, but it was much different to see it. After following the trail they had for a few days, they began seeing signs of demonic activity. Claw marks on trees with lingering demon traces. Water they walked through was tainted. As the signs built up, so did the number of tracks they found. It started with a small group, then a bigger one, then a large one, and then it was too many to count. As the tracks they found indicated the growing army, so too did the environment reflect that. The taint lingered, and with more and more demons gathering together only made it worse. If the demons all died today, the taint would still be around for a while longer. It would take time for nature to defeat before things could get back to normal. Luckily, waiting wasn't the only thing they could do. While leaving the taint wouldn't do anything too harmful, it was better to cleanse it as they passed. There were skills dedicated to doing so, but none had them on the account, no one predicting this happening. They did find out certain affinities worked better than others. Light and lightning worked best of the ones they had, with nature coming in close behind them. The book said holy or angelic affinity worked best, but no one had that affinity. His own ice affinity worked, but not very well. Surprisingly, it did better than fire, which was a shock. Not better than Rachel's fire, but he suspected a different reason for hers working so well. Dragon-tinted flames weren't to be underestimated. Even the infinitely small dragon essence hers contained. Knowing light worked best, the other city's leader was mostly in charge of cleansing the area they were in. Ashton rode side by side with his brother, and Gabriel wasn't far away from them. They did what they could as they traveled, but it started to become unmanageable as they got closer to their target. Even with it being the end of spring with summer right around the corner, leaves were falling off trees and flowers were wilting. A burnt orange or sickly brown plagued the plants, even the atmosphere felt different. stuffy and unwelcoming almost. When they left the city, the whole procession was in somewhat high spirits, but with what everyone was seeing now, it was getting gloomier. Walking through days of doom and gloom ruined morale. Still, Chris and the other city's leader forged ahead. Gabriel suspected his brother wasn't even fazed over such a thing, as his face showed no emotion. Ever since they had left, something was different about him. He didn't talk as much, and it was like a reversion to when they met after the tutorial. Not quite as bad, but it was still a noticeable change. There wasn't a right time to ask him about it, as he was always busy with something. Either planning, ordering people around, talking with the trackers, discussing things with the other city lord, or even smithing sometimes. Not many who volunteered to fight were crafting-oriented, which left the repairs and servicing of weapons and armor to those who had the profession, Chris included. With all of that going on while also traveling for hours every day, it wasn't like Gabriel could walk up and talk with him about it, even if he wanted to. As the days passed, the area only got worse. At the rate it was declining, it would take years for nature to reclaim if left alone. Chris' point of view, they were getting close. Dead trees marred the area, leafless and bare. Anything green had died long ago, and they hadn't seen a beast, a regular untainted beast, in days. All the trackers, they had said they were close. Night watches were doubled and then increased again. Their time spent traveling was decreased as well. They didn't want to run into the enemy while tired from a full-day march. Scouts they sent ahead weren't willing to venture too far, and the tension in the air made people increasingly on edge. It was even worse than their attack on the Mindbreaker. The detrimental effect of the gloomy atmosphere had gotten worse the longer they had to travel through it. The demonic taint in the air tried to wriggle in and pervade your body. It took constant attention to ward it off. The more powerful had it easier, but it was still a constant annoyance to deal with. Everything was adding up to make our trek miserable. With every step forward, it only got worse. Demonic beasts became common, and even demonic plants started popping up. Even knowing that some could be used as rare ingredients didn't help. Chatter quieted and laughter was thoroughly gone. It was almost a relief when we got word from the scouts. We had caught up to the demons. Action immediately broke out as our plans were put into motion. All the scouts were tasked with getting a number and average strength assessment, while the rest of the army did whatever they needed to do to prepare. Dusk was just off the horizon, which set the battle to take place the following day. Demons didn't get any special powers at night, but they didn't have the same disadvantages as we did. They could see just fine in the dark, while we were without such an ability. There were some out there with either the skill or bloodline to help them do just that, but the majority of our army didn't. Plus, a night battle would be a nightmare to direct. While the scouts were off getting us a better picture of what we were dealing with, everyone settled in for one final rest. Tension and worry were at an all-time high. Camps without any fire were bad enough, but it was even worse than that as we sat on the eve of what would be some people's first real fight. Even I felt the jitters, and this was far from my first time. Abigail, point of view, do you think they've found them yet? John asked. The question was one she was asking herself constantly. Ever since half their city left, things had been quiet. Losing that many people was bound to do that, but even the ones who stayed were quieter than usual. All of them knew that not everyone would make it back. Nearly 2 months had passed since Chris set out, and it only got harder as the days went on. She tried to keep busy as best she could, but it was hard. Even the monthly wave went by with little fanfare. John had stepped up big again, and even though it hurt to see him in such danger, it was nice to know their survival didn't depend on one man alone. I don't know, honey, she said. Even if they have, we won't know until they come back, and that will take another month just to get here. A sigh of frustration came out, and she couldn't help but feel dejected. The thing she missed most from before was being able to talk long distances with one another. That way, they would have been able to keep in touch no matter how far away her family went. But that wasn't a thing yet. They knew of communication devices that functioned similarly, but they couldn't figure out how to make them yet. Chris was their best enchanter, and he spent all of his time on wards, not communication devices. The enchanters they did have were still working on various things, but it would be a while until the quality of life they once had was returned to them. Hot water, hell, running water would be helpful. She could technically make water through her affinity, but conjured water wasn't the same as actual water. It didn't have the same minerals or makeup, which made it not a good idea to drink or ingest. Similar to how pure water wasn't good for you. Her book spoke of water crystals being able to draw water out of the air, but they didn't have anything like that. Neither of the dungeons around them dropped gems or crystals, which made acquiring them nearly impossible. To do so, they would either have to venture out and search, find them in a different dungeon farther away, or buy them from the shop. The last option was the furthest from happening because any city that would sell them would have the same need for them as she did. Still, even with John in here to comfort her and her mind trying to run through the treasury reports, it wasn't enough to stop her from thinking about what was going on elsewhere. The report wasn't that important, even if it did show a downtick in sales they had through their pylon. With half the people gone, mostly the citizens who delved into the dungeons every day, they didn't have as much to put up for sale. The material coming out of the dungeon nearly fell to zero after the army left. Their tax money fell with it, but they had enough stored to make it until Chris came back. His delves raked in the coins, as he was one of the only ones going through both entire dungeons every day. No one else could claim to do the same. Not alone, at least. She knew John tried, but he wasn't geared for such a thing. His defense would see him through the lowest levels of both dungeons, but he didn't have the offensive power to kill the things. Both dungeons were growing nicely, though, if what little her books said about such a thing. Without a curator, it was difficult to tell, but the mana they sucked in grew with every passing day. While both had 8 floors currently, she hoped one would reach the 9th soon. Not only would it help with the growth of the city, but it would also add an entire new floor for better materials to come out of. She tried to get everyone to keep track of what they pulled out of specific floors to keep a spreadsheet running. Every floor down was a marked increase in value. Obvious, but it felt good to get specific numbers to back that up. Gaining a 9th floor would increase their profits by over 10% even with only the few who could clear it. There her mind went off in an entirely different direction. She huffed and got back on track. She would make sure they came back to an even better city they left. Chapter 188, The Valley. Chris. Point of view. We need to hit them from the west. It gives us the high ground and it will pin them against the opposite valley wall, Ashton said as he ran his finger over his proposed battle plan. How will we safely descend the steep wall? I could jump it, but what about the others? I said in rebuttal. After a full night of information gathering, the scouts came back with everything they found. The demons were settled into what had once been a lush valley between 2 steep hillsides. The surrounding walls of the valley had sheer drops at certain points, but for the most part, it was only steep hills. The slope made it nearly impossible to climb up or down without significant time and effort. Learning that the demons had holed themselves into such an area, we were all rushing to come up with our plans of action. Where they were gave us the chance to box them in, but it also gave them a defensible advantage. If we just marched at them from the open end of the valley, we would be playing directly into their hand. Plus, if things went poorly for the demons, they could just run out the other side and into the wild. We needed to find a way to get behind them and close off the other end of the valley while also not letting any climb out. With the numbers we had, it was unfeasible to surround them entirely. Another aspect that worried me was the fact the demons were here in the first place. They usually sought out areas of high mana density or rare treasures to consume, yet they were here. Either there was a reason for that deeper in the valley we couldn't see, or there was an intelligent demon leading the pack making them gather here for some reason. The demon had to know if all the humans in the area banded together, it would be outnumbered. Was that why it chose a fortifiable spot? Even so, there wasn't anything else to signify an intelligent demon at the helm. The scouts reported hundreds of demons just milling about in the valley, and some were even fighting each other. Conflict inside the ranks didn't speak of someone formidable in charge. But then again, demons were entirely different than humans, and comparing the demons' actions to that of humans was a fool's errand. They likely didn't care about the infighting that took place. When demons weren't busy fighting the other races, they spent most of their time fighting each other. Still, we had to come up with something, even if it wasn't the best battle plan in the world. We can have any with a bow or significant range up on the crest of the valley while all the warriors charge in from one side, but I don't see how we have the numbers to hold both ends of the valley. even if we spent the time sneaking around them. Hal chimed in. To plan our battle, I didn't restrict any of my family who wished to join. With the numbers we now had, it was infeasible to ask the entire 1,500-strong army to chime in, but the group looking over the maps and scouting report was larger than just me and Ashton. I wanted as many different eyes on this as possible. From my side, Hal, Rachel, Gabriel, Carrie, Mitchell, and my mother all stood around the maps while only 4 stood in for Fort Hope. Ashton, Carson, Noah, and Victoria, the ones we had main contact with and ones highest up in whatever their city leadership was. The disparity in number was opposite our army composition, but I was glad no one said anything. It wouldn't be good to start nipping at each other when we quite literally had bigger fish to fry. No, we don't have the numbers to come at them from both sides. Even one side will be risky as they outnumber us nearly 5-1, Ashton said. We knew they would most likely outnumber us, but no one thought it would be this bad. Given the months to accumulate, I thought there would be 2,000 or 3,000 demons tops, but that turned out to be more like 7 or 8. The good news was they weren't as strong as us on average. The ratio of E-rank to F-rank demons was far lower than what we had behind us, which was some of the only good news to come out of the scouts. Even if none got close enough to get an eye on the leader, the longer information on the leader remained unknown, the more uneasy it made me feel. While I wasn't well versed in demonology, the way they were acting didn't line up with what I had expected. When we finally came across our foe, I expected raving beasts destroying everything in their path and consuming anything they could get their hands on, but that wasn't the case. For some reason, they didn't spread out in all directions looking for sources of mana, but all settled here. We knew from our books there were reasons for that, but none of them implied it happening so soon. Of the reasons demons gathered like this, one worried me the most, but it shouldn't be possible. We were still protected from outside influence. It should be impossible for them to force a convergence. The reason it worried me was because there wasn't anything in what we read about demons that strictly stated that what we were seeing now was impossible, only that it should be in theory, as no other data points from a planet still under the system's protection could be found. Theoretically, our planet was shielded from any and all outside influence. No gods, pantheons, or rogue powers would have any chance of worming their way through the protections provided by the system, which made the books confident that demons forcing a convergence to link our planet to a demonic one through a permanent portal was impossible. Yet I couldn't come up with another reason the demons were acting as they were. That worry extended out to everyone who had background knowledge of the demon race, and it spread quickly through the ranks. As people became aware, things only grew more tense. Knowing that if we failed, the demons could flood in from a permanent portal would doom everyone to death. Unless people came to their senses and rallied together real quick, which I didn't see happening. Our battle, where some might die, turned into a much bigger worldly event, which made the battle planning all the more important. We should return and conscript everyone. We don't have the leeway to only bring volunteers anymore. This is bigger than us. We can't afford to lose. The other city's warrior said. The man, Noah, didn't talk much, and his first words of the meeting were to retreat and bring everyone they had. While sensible, it wasn't practical. We couldn't afford the weeks it would take to go there and back with everyone in tow. Plus, the ones that stayed behind wouldn't be that impactful on the battle to come. No, I said firmly, we cannot wait, nor should we. We have our target and we have time to plan. We need to work with what we have. I was not about to turn back right when we finally had the enemy in our sights. Even if we left and ranged wide to find more help, that wouldn't mean anything if we were too late to stop the threat. Our best bet was to attack now, even if we were outnumbered. The death toll will be high if we attack now. Are you sure about this? My mother asked gingerly. Like I didn't know that. Everyone else looked to me like they were thinking the same thing. It will be high no matter what we do. We can either fight with what we have now or fight a stronger enemy later. Everyone knew what could happen if we waited, even if they didn't want to admit it. Too many things could go wrong between then and now. Too many for us to wait, at least in my opinion. We simply do not have the numbers, Hal said. He was most familiar with the number of demons, and he knew firsthand how many in the valley there were. We have to make do without, then, Ashton said, seconding my opinion that we attack now rather than wait. Rogues are my biggest worry. They don't really have the skills to charge in and fight, nor do they have range. A voice said. Took me a second to recognize it was from Mitchell. As the only rogue among our meeting, it made sense for him to bring it up. The rogue class was something I didn't have much experience planning around, and it was difficult to know what they were capable of. Warriors were easy and so were rangers, but rogues were the odd man out. Their skills were suited for single target damage, as we began calling it, and they weren't equipped for frontline fighting. While that wasn't bad, they also didn't have the range to attack from afar, leaving them in no man's land in terms of what to do. They were great scouts, but they didn't really have a place in grand battles like this. Not unless they wanted to chance light armor and short weapons in a grand melee, but that was just asking to die. Now, saying that every rogue was like this would be false, but the vast majority were. Some excelled at combat and could dance around any number of foes while whittling them down with daggers, but those were the rare cases. Also, rogues could evolve into a great number of things that could either help or hinder their ability to fight like I was asking of them. Affliction specialists and duelists would do fine if they were skilled, but trappers and assassins wouldn't. Saying all that didn't mean they couldn't fight, but it was a giant risk to put people with little armor into that kind of skirmish. Some will be fine to charge in, while some also have excellent range, but the rest? Mitchell clarified. How many? I asked. Numbers were my biggest concern. Of 1584 people who came, 212 were rogues. If we had to go in with 200 fewer people, that would be a problem. I don't know exacts, but around half wouldn't do well in a direct fight. He answered. 100. That wasn't the end of the world. We can have those hold the perimeter to make sure none escape. Any trying to flee should be easy enough for their class to kill, I said. Instead of sending them into a melee where they hold every disadvantage, we could make better use of them on the outskirts to chase down any who tried to flee. There, they would hold the advantage rather than asking them to do what they weren't suited for. Can we afford to lose 100 bodies? We only have around 600 left to charge, Ashton asked. We had more warriors than any other type of class, but that didn't translate directly. If split into ranged and melee, ranged far outnumbered melee. While warrior was most common, it wasn't enough to offset both rangers and mages, especially when only half of the rogues would be joining in the melee. As it stood, it was about half and half in terms of melee and ranged, and that was not good news. 600 leading the charge against thousands didn't sound like good odds no matter how you looked at it. Don't forget the spell blades. They will be going in too, Gabriel added. I had forgotten about that portion of the mage class. The people who evolved into a hybrid that had skills with a weapon while also still being a mage. They could technically do both, but were good at neither in my opinion. Maybe it was just because I didn't like them. Something about spell blades set me off, and I couldn't put my finger on why. There was something inside me that disagreed with the hybridization, even though I had no reason to. They could do whatever they wanted with their class, and I shouldn't have cared. But I couldn't get over it. Anyway, that didn't matter now, and they would add to our number. Not by a lot, but it was better than nothing. Even with the spell blades, the rogues, and the warriors, we were in for a rough fight. The valley would turn into one of death, no matter how much planning went into it. Chapter 189 of Death. Plans were drawn up, orders were issued, and people stood ready for the signal. Everyone had their marching orders, and there was no more reason to delay. The decision to attack was finalized, and everyone's role was clear. Being the leader of one of the two forces, I stood at the front of the group that was to charge ahead. Our position at the front gave us a clear view of the valley we were about to enter. The valley was big enough that we couldn't see the demons we were to fight, but we could clearly see into the depths of where the battle would take place. Mages and rangers stood at the ready behind us, prepared to provide us with ranged support, but that didn't mean much to the people calming their beating hearts at the front. All they saw was the hands of death closing in around them. It stared them in the face because a once lush valley was strangled of everything it had. The only thing left were converted demonic plants or withered plant life. They were to charge in and fight an army that severely outnumbered them. What did they care that they would have ranged support? They were the ones going face to face with literal demons. The weight only made the tensions rise and made me regret agreeing to fight from the side we were already on. We had to wait aimlessly while the rest got into position. Of the 1,500, 600 would charge in melee, of those, half stood behind me. Ashton was in charge of the other half, and his group left hours ago to circle around from the other side. Half and half. The best battle plan we could come up with. No matter how long we stared at the maps or recounted the people with us, the details didn't change. Even if some hoped with all their might that they would. I could only sigh. Even with the strength I held and my wish to keep everyone under me safe, I wouldn't be able to do so. I wouldn't even be able to keep an eye on my family. Every fight since the Mindbreaker where my father fell, I made sure no one else came close to dying. I always had an eye on them or had someone else I trusted completely do the same. Austin and Jonathan mostly, with Rachel being used only rarely. They had the strength to be protectors and I called on them to do it in my place when I couldn't. Austin complained about it constantly, but he never once said no. Not that we babied them either. I was entirely disabused of my notion of doing anything of the sort. My family needed to fight to get strong, and keeping them in glass cages would only hurt them. It was a silent guardian angel sort of watch over them. Stand at the ready to intervene, but not until the fight was lost and death or severe injury was certain. Still, that wasn't possible anymore. This wasn't the kind of fight I could afford to split my attention. It wasn't my job either. My job was clear, and being anywhere near the others wasn't what I had to do. With the abilities we had, historical tactics couldn't work anymore. Not that they didn't work, just that they weren't what was best. You would think with medieval weapons and armor, medieval tactics would be best, but that went out the window with stats and skills. What we used instead were tactics from fiction and fantasy. Some were more well-read in that genre, and we relied upon them heavily for what we were about to do. I felt that we would have come up with these tactics given time, but this was the first time we needed to use them. My role was simple really. With my strength, I was to act like a champion of sorts. The name they called it reminded me of what my previous class was, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was how everyone fought. I was to charge deep into enemy lines and, in their words, cause as much havoc and mayhem as physically possible. Hearing the orders almost made me smile. Havoc and mayhem was something I could definitely do. A few others were given the same task as me, but they didn't look toward their future assignments with a smile. They instead saw it as a death sentence. There were contingencies and plans around them to escape the fighting, but that didn't fill them with confidence. Other than the few strong enough to be assigned the champion role, the others were rather normal. None had training to fight in orderly lines, but I was confident they would be able to get the job done. We did have to sort any that had skills with the possibility of friendly fire differently than the rest and put them near people that wouldn't be affected, but that was left for someone else to work out. We had more than enough people to delegate that tedious task off onto. Plus, some even had the professions for such organizing tasks. They worked wonders as they broke people out into manageable-sized groups and had people with leadership classes take charge, but that didn't really matter to me. I was in charge, technically, and would issue orders if I saw fit, but it was more in the general sense. I wasn't going to micromanage the entire fighting front, nor did I have the ability to. None of that mattered now, though. I couldn't change it even if I wanted to. The silence was near deafening as we waited. It wasn't completely so, but no one was carefree enough to sit and chat with what we were about to do. At most, people talked in hushed whispers, whispering with the person next to them or in front of. For some it was the first time meeting each other. Others were praying, mumbling their words and hoping that the person they were praying to was listening. I did neither. I stood and watched. My armor shined with the fresh polish and my hammer sat on the ground next to me at the ready. My armor was a completely new set I had managed to make while I focused on raising my profession skills. It was now firmly in the uncommon grade. After my create armor skill reached uncommon, it was well overdue to make a new set. I even managed to add a few new runes to it. When before my skill only allowed me to engrave one durability rune, I could now add a few to my armor. One was a frost rune to help it merge with the outer layer of frost armor, and the other was a rune of protection. It was the best I could create, and it glistened in the afternoon sun. My hammer was the same as always, sadly. I had tried to push my ice manipulation skill to form runes on its icy surface, but my skill wasn't high enough to manipulate whatever ice it was made of. I had the feeling it would be possible in the future, but I wasn't there yet, sadly. Unbeknownst to me, as the time drew nearer to battle, the area around me changed. I had to keep my aura in check consciously, and it was starting to slip without me noticing. The people around me could feel a stifling hand pressing down on them and turned to me with wary eyes. Accompanying the stifling aura, the air started to chill. Not to any significant degree, but just the natural effect I had on the area. My mana pool was already full, and any excess leaked out similarly to my aura, causing the two to come hand in hand. I was too focused on what I was about to do to notice, but others certainly did. They shied away from where I stood, and even if there was already a slight gap between us, it grew larger as they tried to step out of my range. While they stepped away, another stepped toward it. "Are you nervous?" a voice asked to bring me out of my running thoughts. I turned to see my brother standing next to me. While he was supposed to be with the other mages, I wasn't surprised he was here. We still had a few more minutes until Ashton was ready on the other side. I admitted. I was nervous for more reasons than one. Not about my own death, but everyone else's. About the possibility of us losing. If we lost, that left the demons to run free. It would leave my city defenseless. Gabriel's face showed shock, but he quickly covered it up. Most likely he was surprised I freely admitted it. His voice faltered. "I can't lose you too." What he said made me turn to look him in the eyes. They weren't brimming with tears, but the sorrow was clear. While he wasn't with us during the fight our dad died in, he had heard about it. He couldn't help but compare the two. "If it is my time, then there is nothing I can do about it," I said steadily. The nature of death was something out of my control. It wasn't something I could stave off or delay. If the fates decided this would be my last battle, then I would make sure to make it memorable. "Don't speak like that," he said venomously. The heat was clear in his tone. We had different outlooks on death. I'd watched as my family fell around me for months, and it colored how I looked at it. Gabriel didn't have that experience. I didn't want it to be my time, and I would do everything in my power to make sure it wasn't, but death wasn't something we could control. Came for everyone equally. Everything in the universe would die eventually. Nothing lived forever. It reminded me of a poem I once heard, and I had a small smile as I recalled the man who once told it to me. "Ours is not to reason why," I said. It was a poem our father had once read to us. Both of us. Gabriel's face changed upon hearing the verse, and he looked off into the valley in front of us with a different expression. His eyes took in the trees and plants, the leaves and flowers. I couldn't tell what went on in his head, but I had a guess. It was an eerily fitting memory to resurface now. Before we could speak on it more, the stone in my hand shattered. The stone was the handiwork of a Fort Hope enchanter, and she somehow linked two stones together. When one shattered, so too did its counterpart. The other half of our forces were ready. The sharp crack caused a deadly silence to fall as everyone knew what it meant. Faces turned grim and helmets were put on. Swords, axes, and spears alike were unsheathed, and the collective atmosphere entirely changed. Everyone here had done battle before. Everyone had gone through a baptism in blood, in one way or another. They were all at least marginally experienced with what was about to happen. Knowing what was to come, I looked down at my hand. My skin was rather pale compared to the shade it usually was during the summer, and on my right index finger sat an unassuming ring. Both hands were ungauntlet, as the additional ice layer would ruin my dexterity if I wore them. Thinking about it, I slid it off and handed it out toward where Gabriel stood. My intent was clear, and no words needed to be said as he took it. He marveled at it for a moment before sliding it on to one of his fingers. If the worst were to happen, he would keep it safe. With that last order of business taken care of, I turned and faced the brave souls behind me, the ones who would join me in this battle. "It is my great honor to fight alongside you. For better or worse, we march to end the threat against us. If you are to fall, know you did so in defense of your loved ones. Do not fear it, for it is not a bad thing. You should not fear such an end, for I can think of no greater honor." I knew my words weren't the most inspiring speech in the world, but I said them from the heart and meant them. I hoped that everyone who heard them recognized that. Ashton was probably giving a grand, inspiring speech to his half on the other side, no doubt, But I wasn't going to let the last words people heard be lies. Nor was I going to prop people up with false hope. The time for grand speeches came and went. I took my helmet from the ground and placed it on my head with both hands. With one last deep breath, I hefted my hammer from its place on the ground next to me. Sounds of the same happening rang out from behind me, and I could only imagine what it looked like for our group of hundreds to prepare. For hundreds of weapons to ready and all point in the same direction. My blood began to pump and I could feel my anticipation rise. The time for action had arrived and I met it with open arms. Lifting my hammer straight into the air for all to see, I said the last word that many behind me would ever hear. Charge! I took off and everyone fell in behind me. 321 men and women followed my charge. 321 warriors ran into battle. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Chapter 190 Charge. Chris. Point of view. Shouts and roars followed after giving the order to charge, and were all that could be heard as my feet propelled me forward. With every step, I prepared for what was to come. I didn't know how long this battle would last, but I couldn't afford to keep anything back. My job was to cause as much mayhem as possible, and to do that required my full strength. The small rodent monster I had stored next to me died silently, and was the first casualty of the day. It would be far from the last. Momentum of the avalanche started to build as I had kept a monster for that sole reason. Righteous fury was lined up to activate as soon as we crashed into our foes. Speaking of our foes, they felt the disturbance of our charge, and I could see them rush mindlessly toward us, the same as we did to them. We had stayed out of sight to keep the element of surprise, but that was broken as we charged. Hounds larger than any Doberman I had ever seen with devilish flames rolling off their forms were just one among the many. All manner of grotesque demonlings made up a large portion of the bodies we ran towards. Their shapes and sizes made one ever so different than the next. Some with spear-like limbs ran toward us with every step piercing into the ground, while others with club-like feet thudded forward. Bulbous and disgusting imps flew in the air at head height. Even worse were the nearly humanoid lesser demons. They were an evolved version of demonlings that usually increased their intelligence and changed their forms into something more bipedal. Not all were bipedal, but more likely than not they were. As my eyes roved over the sea of monsters we charged toward, they focused on the lesser demons first because they were the biggest threat I could see. They had the intelligence and cunning that the rest didn't. The second biggest threat was when I noticed the growing forms of something coming together. I wasn't sure what I was looking at first. It started as a large blob of body parts and blackened flesh. Then it started to grow. Demonlings bunched together in large piles of bodies and began to morph into each other in some way. I was too far away to hear anything, especially against the pounding feet of our charge, but my mind didn't have any trouble conjuring the squelches and squeals that I imagined it sounded like. The process wasn't fast, but neither was it slow. If I had been standing beside the pile of flesh as the process started, I could have stopped it, but that wasn't the case. I watched as giant amalgamations of any number of the foul creatures attached together to turn into towering versions of themselves. I dubbed them giant demonlings because after the changes stopped, they took on the form of a mixture of a number of them. All of the demons we charged toward gave off a revolting feeling, but those were the worst. My mind couldn't stop picturing the forming process. Before our presence was revealed, the mass of different demons were content to mill about in a roughly circular area, the center of which was where I assumed the leader to be. And I assumed there would be a leader. The demons were too organized for there not to be one. After the demons on the edge of their cluster noticed us, they charged indiscriminately. It was like they saw red and took off toward us, their previous actions forgotten. With both sides running toward the other, the distance closed quickly. Our mages and rangers were already set up at the appropriate distance for them, and I felt when they attacked. All of my attention was wired and ready to take in anything that could go wrong, which left me in the prime position to feel when the mana from hundreds of people charged into various skills. The manner and means were all different. Rangers, mages, and healers casting buffs. It was all different, but the tide of mana that erupted was impossible to miss. Even an inept could feel the power amassed in so many skills. Certain warriors among the line sped up or glowed. Others took on a colored light, causing all their attacks to take on an elemental effect. Most healers that deigned to come had at least one boosting skill, and they were all on display now. None fell on me, as I told every healer in no uncertain terms that they should not use any boosts on me. I felt they were better used on the rest. If one more person survived because they had that extra boost, it was worth it. Plus, I wasn't sure how many boosting skills could be stacked on a person. I already had a few and I wasn't willing to push it. Avalanche at full power already strained my body. Adding Fury and Glacial Presence only made the strain higher. Adding an additional boost from a healer onto that didn't seem like a good idea. The boost layered on the warriors were the first to take effect, but then came the sky-darkening volley of magical skills. Every mage had the chance to power up on opening salvo of whatever they could, and their job was to soften the enemy up before we collided. Fire, ice, lightning, water, metal, earth, wind, nature, and even neutral mana were all represented. Those elemental affinities were most common and easiest to pick out among the carpet of mana being launched. Other, either more esoteric or rare, affinities were also among the sea. Blood, solar, kinetic. The amassed skills were too much for me to pinpoint anything else, but I knew at least that many. I could feel the enormous amount of mana pass overhead and braced my eyes for what was to come. Even braced for what I was about to see, it still blew my mind. Now in my field of vision, I could clearly see all manner of magical attacks rain down from the sky. The one that stood out the most was the giant fireball that gave even me a tinge of worry. Wherever that landed, I did not doubt the devastation it would cause. I wasn't able to take it in long, as before I knew it, they made impact with the ground. Explosions rocked the earth and the vibrations spread all the way to my feet. The force was so large. Wind buffeted our line as the air was violently pushed away. As the spells destabilized, their effects complete and destruction wrought, the mana they contained mixed and caused further destruction. Lightning and fire didn't mix with other mana types on the best of days, and this was similar to priming a powder keg to blow. It was like watching the sky fall. The sea of arrows sticking out of bodies or the ground was nearly imperceptible compared to the wash of colorful explosions. The arrows were nearly perfectly hidden among the numerous magic spells. That didn't mean the devastation they caused was any less, only it was far more concealed. The sound of arrows thudding down into flesh and earth was drowned out compared to the other things that happened. Plants and trees were uprooted, clods of earth shot off in every which way, some going as high as 100 feet in the air. The chants of those running at the front reached their climax as they took it all in. That was until we watched the demons return fire. It was far from orderly or even coordinated, but the sheer amount made up for that fact. Where we had a few hundred launch skills from our side, they had thousands. Where the wall of magic from our side was filled with nearly every color, the magic from the demons was less diverse. The spells were all either a sickly black or crimson red, and they gave off the feeling of death and blood or somewhere in between. The spells mostly came from the imps and lesser demons, but there were too many to say so definitively. The chanting and shouting from the people charging with me fell audibly as we saw the spells aimed at us. Some slowed to activate defensive skills, while others ran while weaving mana into various shields. Those with actual shields held them in front and they lit up. I did none of that. My stride stayed steady, and the only thing that changed was my form started to get covered in ice. Frost armor froze around me with even greater speed and strength thanks to the frost rune I had carved, saving precious seconds if the need for quick armament were to arrive. The mana pushed into the skill passing through the rune on the armor increased in both purity and density before filling out around me. Greaves froze and locked into leggings which connected with the chest piece. Thick plates of ice extended out over my armor, and my feet left frosty footprints in the grass as I passed. The skill finished with a helmet of ice covering my head. Where I once had to leave eye holes to see, they were frozen over completely with ice crystals so clear they looked like glass. One of the many things I focused on while training in the dungeon was the application of my skills, and frost armor underwent massive changes as the months went by. Before, I would have let it form on its own, believing that the skill knew best and to leave it to do its thing. Now, with more experience and knowledge, I knew that was the wrong choice. With time to spare and ideas abound, It was the skill I focused on most. My smithing experience filled me with ideas on how to push the skill further. The armor was now more streamlined, and the linking chinks of armor were far more sturdy. The armor froze into place with time to spare as the black and red magic fell. Even as they fell upon me and the area around me, I charged forward without slowing. The skills of the demons were far too low to leave a scratch on my armor, let alone with my law running through it. Another bonus of spending hours in the dungeons every day was the application of my law became easier. Where it once took a great amount of effort and control to empower my entire armor with my law of ice, it became like second nature after doing it thousands of times. I wasn't the only one to break through the other side of mana covered in some manner of elemental armor, as others were clad in their affinity as well. If Jonathan were here, I knew he would be right next to me clad in earth leaving craters with every footfall. If Austin were here, he would be dodging left and right while using me as a human shield. But they weren't, and I was left to lead alone. Arrows and magic continued to fly, but that wasn't where my attention was focused. We were close enough now that I could see the saliva and spittle fly out of the hellhounds' mouths. Close enough that I could see the lines demarking where one demonling ended and another began on their giant, mashed-together form. Those who had to stop and deploy defensive skills fell behind while those who charged through would hit first, and prime among them was me. Close enough that I started to change. Ice burned through my veins as I burned my bloodline, and a white-hot fury cascaded through me next. Both my bloodline and righteous fury pushed me and my stats to new heights. Permafrost and desolate blizzard billowed out, and for the first time in a long while I held nothing back.